Welcome back, everyone. This is the Product Show with Colin Pell, your host, and today is episode 16. If you are new here, this is the 1 minute rundown of the Product Uncensored show. I write on www.productuncensored.com. Videos are on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe. Audio or podcasts, we're available on all major podcasting platforms. And something new for all our listeners, viewers, readers this week is that I've been getting questions about how people can support the show. And I've decided to sign up for a Buy Me a Coffee account. So you can now support the show for the cost of a coffee. And if you have supported me, thank you very much. If not, don't worry about it. Just keep listening, keep watching, giving me feedback. That will be more than enough. Okay, all that is out of the way. I want to get straight into episode 16. And today we have a very special guest. I say that for every single guest because I truly believe that all our guests are special. This guest today, she's a product leader, she's an author, she's just signed a book. We're going to go into, well, she didn't just sign it, but we're going to get into that later on. She's now living in the city nation of Singapore, and her latest update is that she's now teaching at the Northeastern University, the Amor McKim School of Business. That is an incredible mouthful. But yes, that's where she's teaching, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. So everyone, put your hands up in the air and say hello to Radhika Dutt. Welcome to the show, Radhika.
Thank you, Colin. It's great to be here.
Yes, it is fantastic. I was just telling Radhika just before we started recording, she looked a bit different, and that's mainly because I was watching some of the older videos and she had shorter hair. And she made a good point, right? Because lockdown, not many people have gone, to get their hair done in that sense. How are things in Singapore, Radhika?
They're actually really good. Things pretty much feel back to normal. And thinking about product, it amazes me how Singapore has dealt with COVID. I say that because they continuously give people updates in terms of what's the community spread, all these different stats, etc. So right now it's at about 1 to 2 people per day who are testing positive. So it's not too bad.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and just to let you know, it hurts me when you say, Singapore's doing really well because I'm Malaysian. So for those of you who don't know, right?
You guys are doing so well too. Sorry, my comparison right now is with the US.
Yeah. So listeners, just to give you a bit more nuance into Asia, right? So Singapore and Malaysia used to be one country, then we split. So this was like a bad breakup, So every other time we throw stones at each other across the causeway. So that's just a little bit.
So not intentional.
All right, Radhika, let's start with, we're going to go pull this all the way from the start into MIT. Let's start there, right? Because you studied in MIT. And obviously, see, look at this cap. This is a tribute to Boston. So
I see that. Thank you.
And the question I was going to start off with, right? How did you get into MIT and why did you decide to study what you did? Because let me caveat the question by saying, MIT is not for everyone. It's hard to get in there. It's only smart people get in there. So I have to assume that you have to be very smart.
It's fascinating you say that because I think there's such a sense of imposter syndrome, right? I think when I went into MIT first, for a long time, I kind of wondered if I really belonged there. And my background was that I was in South Africa. I was the first non-white in my class. I had to really kind of prove myself. I was part of that class in South Africa where we were the only ones to whom they taught calculus. It was all these struggles that I wrote about in my MIT, that I didn't even actually write about in my MIT essay. And so now looking back, there was something that they saw in there that I didn't really even realize, that I didn't really even talk about my struggles. And part of it was because of that imposter syndrome. So how did I get in there? I do feel like, part of it is, yes, you're good, right? But there's also an element of um, of honestly luck, because there are so many deserving people who are also smart. And so, yeah, I think my realization after coming out of MIT is that those who are smart are humble and realize that you're not there only because you're so good, right? You're there because you had a privilege. And I'm really honored and grateful that I had that privilege.
Okay. And why did you choose electrical engineering? That was your degree, right? Electrical engineering.
Yeah. So, I've always felt like I've wanted to be an engineer, but in hindsight, right, was it my wanting to be an engineer or wanting to build things? It's kind of an unknown. So, look, I'm glad I studied electrical engineering, but I will say that I'm not the engineer who's passionate about it. I look at my husband. We met at MIT. He studied software. His hobby is software. When we live in Boston, he has a whole server farm in the basement. I mean, that's his passion. For me, electrical engineering just wasn't doing it for me. And so the first startup that I had after school, it led me into more of the business path. And that's where I realized my passion was.
Okay, very nice. And talking about business, you didn't take any a master's in business or things like that. You actually did your master's in electrical engineering and computer science as well. So again, that's very interesting for someone who didn't really know whether electrical engineering was the path. You actually went one step further as well.
It's true. I think, part of it was when we were at MIT, when, okay, so MIT also has the Sloan School.
Yes.
At the time when we were studying engineering, we felt like that was the true calling, that, coming from Sloan School, it was almost like a derogatory if we said you were a Sloanie. And so and so, there was this thing where the Sloan people, it was all about networking and talking and things like that. It wasn't about doing. And so it became this thing where I wonder, in hindsight, if it was because of that feeling that I was like, no, I'm not doing business school. And because engineering felt authentic, right?
Yeah.
And so part of that is I've carried that forward, where I feel like we can be in business and we can be authentic. And I think at the time, I just didn't pursue going into business school because it didn't feel authentic from, my brief experience.
Your train of thought would be very similar to probably, like, I don't know, 80% of Asian parents, where they tell you that, oh, you want to do business? No, business is not very good. But if you want to be a doctor, you want to be an engineer, now that is good because it's technical. And if I pay for your education, now that's a good course to take. So yeah, actually, if you watch back some of the other guests that I've had on the show, especially those who were in the Southeast Asian region, and Vincent is the exception from the Hong Kong, but he had the same problem as well, right? You're trying to justify to your parents why you were doing this thing, either called computer science or business, but basically anything that's not the traditional field of schooling. They'll be like, are you sure? This is not a good use of my money. So.
It's funny, like my parents actually were encouraging it. I was the one saying, not for me. And, it's so true what you say about the Asian thing, though, but because my daughter went to a summer camp in Hong Kong, and one of her classmates was explaining why he was doing that course. And he said, as my mother says, doctor, engineer, or disappointment.
Oh, okay. Wow, savage, very savage. Yeah. Okay. One last joke about kids, since you brought it up. I'll tell you this one joke about my kids. So, my younger son, he's 4, and we've been in lockdown. We were in lockdown in Malaysia as well. So, pretty much couldn't do anything, staying home, and we used to watch these press conferences by the Prime Minister. And also because of that, we were ordering a lot of food. Because, I mean, we started off by cooking every meal, but realized we were just going to die trying. So we tried to have one meal that we would order through delivery and one we cook. And we always use Grab. And so one day my son, we were talking to him, and he says, oh, when I grow up, I want to be a government. because he kept watching these press conferences, looking at the prime minister. And what was option number 2? He wants to be a Grab driver. So yeah. Anyway, that's enough about that. We are very off track. But let's go and talk about the startup. You said when you came out of school, right? So were you bitten by that startup bug when you graduated? Was it because of that? What was the motivation behind the startup?
Yeah, it was actually bitten by the startup bug before graduating. So we used to get together, in a group, and we used to talk about, what ideas can we put together, like, and this was back in 1999, and I was actually still in school at the time. And so that's when we started discussing ideas. And we actually started that company, Lobby 7, while I was still working on my master's thesis and so on. Yeah, it was an exciting time to start a company, right? With the economy really on an upswing.
Yep. And that was like 99. That would still be the dot-com boom, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, we started the company, got funding, and then the market went.
Yeah. And over the course of your career as well, you started like what, 2 or 3? Was it 2 or 3?
2 companies.
2 companies, right? I wanted to talk a little bit about startups as well, because in your talks about radical product thinking, and by the way, we're going to go deep dive into radical product thinking a little later. You talk about how there is a problem with the way that we build stuff, right? The way that product is developed and how things work. And one of the things that I've always been very curious about, but I never grew up in the States or stayed there any longer for a month. So that's the longest I've been there. And I'm always curious to know the startup scene, right? Seems to have since you like to talk about diseases, it has a disease where it's all about getting funding and growth at all costs. How prevalent is that today, and how was it like when you were doing startups? I mean, in the case of your first startup.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It is so prevalent today, and it was just as prevalent when I was starting a company. And in fact, we very much had the same attitude when we were starting out. And we were just kids starting out, and you can see why one would have that attitude, right? That's this growth at all costs, and becoming big is really what gets a lot of media attention. And so everyone feels like that's what we really need to strive for. And so yeah, nothing it feels like it's really changed. But what you talk about in terms of these product diseases, it's so prevalent because of this growth at all costs. What I've realized over time, right, is that we tend to iterate and just overuse iteration to be able to move KPI up into the right. It's about that growth, being able to show those financial KPIs. And in the process of that, we end up making a lot of short-term decisions. It's a lot of short-term thinking. That isn't necessarily how we build successful products. And so this pattern of mistakes is what I started calling product diseases. But unfortunately, there's, more recently in the last maybe 10 years, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that there's a side effect to this growth at all costs. And that's what I've started calling digital pollution, that we're really fraying the fabric of society by pursuing just these financial KPI at all costs.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I was actually recently speaking to one startup founder, got funding, and he was saying, okay, right now, we really want to scale our team and blah blah blah. So that's all fantastic. So I was just very curious. So I asked him, so what is your North Star metric, so to speak, right? What is that one thing? I was like, oh, it's just active users. I was like, oh, okay. And what about things like getting profitable? No, that's not important right now. All I want is just active users and growth. Okay, so it sort of came real because I always hear it, but that was my first time where I've heard a founder say it flat out, I really don't care about anything else except growth. I was like, wow, that is insane. So okay, yeah. So does it? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think there's, so if you heard Masayoshi Son talk about their investment strategy, right? They said, well, winner takes all. And so that's why they look to who's winning, and then they just put a massive amount of money in there.
Yeah.
And kind of this idea that winner takes all is what we're seeing, because you have the big tech players and they basically gobble up all of the interesting smaller players who come along. And so everyone has this motivation that unless you are that leading player, you can't really have a good exit strategy. And so that's why this attitude that, it's this financial KPI at all costs. And to give that example, you talked about that startup. I was talking to one startup. I was talking to a founder. His app actually went viral. And so then I said, well, this sounds really interesting. What's your vision for the world? And they build chatbots, right? Chatbots with personality. And so he goes, well, my vision is that we have, at the end state, all these chatbots who are friends with you, chatbots are friends with each other. I was like, okay, that brings up like some issues around privacy. What if your HR chatbot is talking to your mental health chatbot? And so he goes, well, that's not an issue right now. Once we become big, then just like Facebook, we'll deal with it using AI. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's going really well for Facebook, isn't it? And he takes it a step further. He says, well, anything that would slow down growth right now for us would be unacceptable. And that's where, I feel like, yes, you should be building.
Yeah, can you repeat that for a while? I think your mic just dropped off for like 2 seconds.
Oh, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, now you're fine. Just that 2 seconds here.
Yeah, so he was saying basically that, anything that slows down growth is not acceptable. But this is the thing about entrepreneurship, that when we build products, we affect people. And so, my approach is that we should be able to build successful products, but it comes with the responsibility that with great power comes great responsibility, that we also need to think about our effect on society.
I totally agree. And that's, I think, one of the conversations that's becoming more prevalent, especially in the circles I operate in, at least within the Southeast Asian region, about, ethical product management. It's a tough conversation, especially when many of the countries in Southeast Asia are still developing in that sense. So even simple things like civic consciousness, is not really that widespread in that sense, so to speak. It's not like, top of mind kind of thing. But I think that's the conversation that also needs to happen, in very developed countries like the US, where, the thought of, just being the next big thing has just totally eclipsed all sort of sense and sensibility in that sense. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So yeah, that one of the things I wanted to just understand was, whether things have changed since you started doing startup out of school. The other part that I wanted to get your thoughts, experience about is also in your career, you've worked in, startups that you founded, and also really, really big companies like Cisco, for example. It's a huge ass company, right? And how do you find the practices differ between, startup and, big, humongous companies?
I think you'll probably find, my personal bias very easily in my resume. The fact that, I love the smaller companies where you have more autonomy. The larger these companies go, I think the more you spend time talking, and it's harder to get things done. And so as an entrepreneur, I find it really hard to work in really large companies. But I think, funny enough, I say that, and yet now I'm starting to work with the government here. I think part of it is is the desire for change, right? And whether there is enough like momentum for wanting to do something different. And I think that's really what I seek, the autonomy and momentum. There are some places that even when they're big, they still carry that momentum, and there's this desire that we want to create change. And when that happens, that still makes those places fun and feel more dynamic.
Yeah, but I mean, I totally agree with that. So, what would you say would be the biggest obstacles, or rather, the challenges to overcome when you join a huge company? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of consensus building, right? And I think as a product manager, what I've realized is when we start asking someone, what drives you? Like, what makes work feel meaningful for you? So some people answer the question saying solving hard problems. Other people say, oh, developing people and teams and things like that. And then there's a third category of people saying, when I actually see stuff being built and customers using it. And those are usually three categories, and people, and yes, people feel, satisfaction out of all three, but one is usually the primary driver. The people who do well in big companies, I think as product managers, are more the ones who are people oriented, where they're happy to build all this consensus, and really try to drive all the stakeholder buy-in, etc. That part, there's so much of that in bigger companies that unless that's a major part of what drives satisfaction for you, it's hard to thrive in that environment.
Yep, the curse of red tape and bureaucracy.
But I
Okay.
think
No, go
it's
ahead.
also part of what you end up enjoying. Like some people find people is their passion. For me, it's creating change. Like when I see the effect of what I'm done, of what I'm doing, right? But people is, you need to figure out how to work with people to be able to do that. So that's kind of the secondary thing for me. For some people, the people part is the primary. Those people do really well with large organizations.
Okay, very, very interesting. And then now on the flip side, what do you think would be the biggest challenge of working in a startup, small,
Yeah, I think for me as a CEO, the hardest part is being very introspective. I think, if you're an entrepreneur or in a smaller, well, okay, I guess two categories. One is if you're a CEO of a company, you have to be able to be introspective, but not let that get to you, because you think so much about, is this the right decision or not? And you really don't know. And you feel responsible for so many people. So yeah, having that support group so that you can talk about, just not knowing, but having to make those decisions, I think was probably the hardest part for me in the startup world. I think as a product person in a startup, it's different. I think you have a lot of autonomy. You just have to find the right startup to work in, because in many startups, the founder still sees themselves as the product owner or the product leader, and so you may not have that autonomy. And so that's often a challenge working with the founder in a startup.
Yeah, that was something that I was talking about with another guest, right? How, yeah, I think it was Rich, the first guest on the show, about how you transfer or transition the center of gravity for product from the founder to the first product hire, and the challenge of doing that, because not all founders can let go so easily, despite what they say, and this is not to shit on them, so to speak, but it's just that it's difficult, right? Because it was your baby, you thought about everything, and then now you're expected to let it go. Yeah, okay. I think, yeah, I definitely agree there, and I dare say that a lot of people would agree with you as well. Now, last question, just around your background and who you are. You've done work in marketing as well, and also work in product management. And in my experience, marketing and product management is where you either get really good cohesion or you get lots of um, fireworks. It could either be really bad or really good. And yeah, how do you find or rather, how would you say would be the best way for marketing and product teams to work together, given that you've had experience with both?
That's really an interesting question. I haven't had the opposite experience of marketing and product management not working well together.
Mm.
And I guess both at Avid Technology or even my own startup, my co-founder was someone who was amazing at marketing. And so, we worked so closely together that product management and marketing really had to work closely and in sync. Even when I was at Avid and we were a much bigger company, I can't think of when that didn't happen. But I take your point. I completely agree that unless there is that cohesion, things don't work well together. So one of the things that I talk about as part of radical product thinking is when you're a product person, you should create a strategic cross-functional roadmap, meaning that, very often we think about a roadmap just as engineering and at most engineering and design deliverables. So instead, it should contain other things that include how will the product get to your customer, which is marketing, and initiatives that are about training, support, etc. And so that as you release your product, you're thinking about all of these things and how that roadmap evolves for those other items. And this way, it helps bring those elements along with you and coordinated with you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the stories that I've heard, and even in one of my own experiences, is that the tension, or when it starts becoming difficult, is when the campaigns or the strategies that are employed are very tactical, very for the now, and when they don't really have a sense for the next, or the longer term play. I think that's where it sometimes, there's a bit of friction. I won't say, it's not fireworks and taking guns and shooting each other. It's just that, yeah, it creates that friction.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things, and maybe you're referring to it as marketing, but one of the things that I've struggled with in companies is where the product person doesn't have any say in how the product is priced.
Mm.
And when that happens, right, then again, it's exactly what you talked about, which is that it may be a short-term way of thinking about the product. And if we haven't thought about that pricing and how features align with that pricing, etc., it makes it much harder in the longer term.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of view about the pricing part. Okay, yeah. So for those of you who are having, friction with your marketing teams, go figure out, is it related to the pricing and your long-term versus short-term gains that you're trying to play into. Very good. Sorry, I said it would be a last question, but I actually forgot one very important question. How did you end up in Singapore? Because you were, living life, the great life in Massachusetts and in the great US, land of opportunity, and suddenly you're now in this state that is a country that is smaller than most US states. So,
actually, funny enough, Singapore is exactly the size of the Greater Boston area.
Yeah, it's just Boston, right? Not the whole of Massachusetts.
Well, Boston feels like a little bubble that we live in. So
that is true. That is true.
Bubble there, bubble here. So how did we end up here? So we'd lived in the US for so long. And, my own background is that I've lived in so many countries, grew up in India, then lived in South Africa, then moved to the US. My children had grown up in the US all along. And we really just wanted to give them the experience of seeing more of the world, being in Asia. And so my husband works in the self-driving car, which is based both out of Boston and in Singapore. And so we said, let's move to Singapore. We'd never been there before. And we said, well, we're going to move there for 1 year. So who cares that we haven't seen it? It's going to be an adventure for 1 year. Let's just move and then we'll figure it out. So we moved here. And 2 years later, we're still here. And so, and about a year into it is when I started working with the government here, with the Monetary Authority.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one as well. I probably won't go into that because I want to go into the really interesting stuff. But yeah, maybe if we have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about how you ended up working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore as well. So I wanted to jump into radical product thinking, and that's been something that you've been talking about, at PMF, at LTP. I don't know where else you've talked about it, probably many other places, but those are the two ones that I've seen. And in fact, I think I met you at PMF when you were talking about radical product thinking as well. So what is the genesis of radical product thinking? Yes. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I had been, as you saw from my background, right? Like I'd worked in so many different industries and sizes of companies. And I mentioned product diseases. So it was the same set of product diseases that were happening in large and small companies, and regardless of industry verticals. And the second thing, right? So what I mean by these product diseases is that it's easy to make mistakes in the process of translating an idea into reality. And somewhere between, having a vision for your idea and executing on your idea, there comes a disconnect. And whenever there's this disconnect is where you end up with these product diseases. So what I saw was that, there were some product people who just innately were just good at this, right? They just innately knew how to build good products. And other people, they weren't naturally good at it. And so it led me to this question of, is it that this is an innate skill where you just kind of have it or you don't? Or is this something that we can really teach people systematically? And the last time this came about was because I was building my own product team. And just, even there were some people I could hire out of college, and they just had this feeling for product management. And so that was the genesis. Like, can we teach people systematically how to build good products? And it evolved from there. And so basically, first, in terms of putting together radical product thinking, it was two other people that I'd been working with, Nidhi Agarwal and Jordi Cadies, and we crafted this whole framework so that we could take people systematically from building, how do you build a good vision? What is a comprehensive product strategy? And giving people just this very simple set of tools that makes it easy to do each step. Mm-hmm. And then the evolution has now been that, since we launched this in 2017, it's now become this global movement where there are people around the world who are using this approach. And it's become this movement where people feel like, this is a good way of not just building products, but also a way of thinking about responsibility and how do we build good products that make the world better.
Very interesting. Yeah, one of my questions I was going to ask you, which you've already answered, was, is radical product thinking a framework? Is it a movement? But it sounds like you're just saying it sort of has naturally evolved from what started out as a simple framework to becoming a community of people who use the framework.
Yeah, exactly. And really, it's a methodology for building successful products. So the way I describe it is, you have lean startup as a methodology, and it's become a movement. Similarly, what I find is lean startup helps you with iteration and building products fast. And radical product thinking helps you think about what's the right vision for you, what's the strategy. It helps you provide all the direction. So lean startup gives you speed, radical product thinking gives you direction. And together, speed plus direction gives you velocity. And that's how the two go together.
Yeah, because I still remember when I first heard it, and you're talking about how pivotitis, I think, was the disease you were talking about, and I was thinking like, but you were saying that lean was something that was sort of exacerbating the problem, and I really had to think about that, because I've been using lean as part of how I do my role as a product manager, as a product leader, and to have to rethink that was tough. I'll admit. And the thing I think, and I would love to get your thoughts, is that there is this part of the problem is that a lot of people take what they think is great about a particular framework and completely disregard the rest. So like for lean, the easiest one is that, look, especially the lean startup, so Eric Ries's book was, phenomenal. And what has come out as an after effect of that, the not so good part, is people think that it's all about just pivoting, and totally bypassing the fact that the whole idea was the build, measure, learn triangle and validated learning. when people talked about agile, it was all about, hey, how can we not be so bogged down by documentation and things like that. And the after effect of that was everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and suddenly it's all about, hey, we don't need documentation, we're rock stars, we're gonna build this shit and then we'll worry about it later. So I like the way that you framed it, that radical product thinking helps you with the direction, and when you pair it together, it's something that's going to help in that sense. And so that brings me to my next question. How important is it for people in product, or even in organization actually, that they don't just look at one particular framework and look at that as the mecca, or the silver bullet?
Yeah, so important, right? Because as you say, I think Lean was great, Agile was great, and I use both of those. The point is just that sometimes we overuse iteration. At a company recently, one of the executives, we told them, like, look, we don't have the right design resource. And he says, well, that's just going to mean a few extra iterations, but we'll get there. And so the thing is, like, iteration has become the solution to everything. And so this is the piece where, I think we have to look at frameworks and say, well, what part is good out of each framework, and then combine them with others.
Okay, and coming back to my question, how do you make sure because obviously you are the chief evangelist for radical product thinking, right? How do you make sure that the people who are adopting this framework don't take it as a silver bullet? Because it's very easy, right, for people to say, this sounds great, Radhika, like I want to take this, and then 2 weeks later, this is rubbish, this doesn't work. Why? Because they took it as the silver bullet.
Yeah, whenever a methodology really takes off, right, that is going to happen. So that's just one thing even when we started radical product thinking and crafted this framework, we accepted that this is kind of part of what happens with frameworks. And so our approach to this was, we've tried to make it very systematic and step by step, where we make it like the vision statement that we've crafted. It's a Mad Libs like fill in the blank statement, so that it's really easy for teams to fill it out, right? But that said, how do you fill it out? How do you know you've filled it out right? So we try to provide more support by, I've even created templates that are filled out based on my startup, saying, well, here's something where it shows you to what level of detail you want to fill these out. But despite all of these things, I think, we just are, as product leaders, we're in a rush, under pressure. And so we don't necessarily have access to all of this information. We look at sound bites, and that's often what happens, especially if something becomes popular, someone recommends it to someone else. And yeah, you kind of get the sound bites out of it. So I kind of expect that maybe years from now, we'll hear, oh, radical product thinking, it all went wrong. Here's what you need to do instead.
Yeah. Okay. That's true. All right. I'm sorry, our listeners and viewers, there was some technical problems. My Mac crashed. So I've had to sort of restart this. So we're going to pull this back a little bit and, go back with Radhika to the question of the silver bullet. So Radhika, before our technical problem happened, I was asking you about the silver bullet disease, where, when a particular framework you were saying it actually, where a particular framework takes off, the concern here is that people take it as the silver bullet, right? Like everything is, hey, it's supposed to be working for me, and now it didn't solve any of my problems.
Yeah. So I think, with any methodology that becomes successful, that tends to happen. Like, I think, even if we look at Lean Startup, in one of the chapters, or even in the early chapters, Eric Ries talks about how you need a vision and then here's what you do. But I think that part often gets overlooked because, one of the other things that is often said about Lean Startup is, you don't have to focus on your business plan so much anymore. you focus on just doing and trying and then iterating. And so I think, it's all about confirmation bias. We hear what we want to hear. And, writing a good vision, etc., that takes a lot of just emotional and mental bandwidth to do that work. And so doing feels very satisfying. And so we all hear what we want to hear, and then the methodology, and we kind of adopt those elements. And so I think, as any methodology becomes successful, we'll get what we want out of it. But I think the intent really that we've tried to convey through radical product thinking is that we really need a good vision, meaning answering detailed questions that isn't traditionally done as part of writing a vision. Typically conventional wisdom about a vision is it has to be short, like a slogan, so that it's memorable. It has to be big and aspirational, like how you're going to change the world. Or very often it's called a BHAG, right, which is a big, hairy, audacious goal. And so basically a vision is supposed to be heroic. We take it down to, no, a vision should really be something that's the authentic change that you want to build. And what's that, and getting you to describe that in a lot of detail. So as part of the framework, we try to provide the intent behind it, that this direction comes from sharing and communicating a lot of this detail and your rationale. And really, that's the intent of radical product thinking, a toolkit for sharing, communicating, thinking through your direction that you can then use to get into lean and agile development.
Okay, so let's talk about that toolkit a little bit. So, by the way, for those of you who don't know, the toolkit is available for free on radicalproduct.com. And I'm looking through that toolkit. And one of the things that you've brought up in your talks as well is having that vision that you've just mentioned. Now, the vision has this part that says, today when this is the customer wants to, and it goes down, and there's a part that says, this is unacceptable because, and you're supposed to put in the shortcomings of the current solution. And then it goes on to say, we envision a world where shortcomings are resolved. And I guess the question for you here is that I asked it the question slightly different the first time around. So maybe I'll ask it slightly differently as well. How do we make sure that we are being holistic in the approach where shortcomings are resolved, but not sacrificing the speed, mainly about the speed, I think, because especially, so I'm going to ask this question from a startup perspective. Speed is always what you need because you're struggling to find product market fit. Your funding may be running out, your runway is short. And, not everyone might say, hey, I don't want to envision a world where all the shortcomings are resolved.
Yeah, definitely. We definitely don't even want people to think that they should be resolving all the shortcomings. So the idea with the vision statement is that it makes you answer 4 questions. So whose world are you trying to change? And so it gets very specific in terms of defining that who. So it's as detailed as saying, it's not like people everywhere. To give you an example of my startup, we said, we wanted to target amateur wine drinkers. And so we got very specific. What does it mean to say amateur wine drinkers? And we described wine drinkers on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is, I know nothing about wine, and 10 is, I'm a winemaker, I know all there is to know. And we were targeting people who were from a level 2 to a 6, because we found that above a 6, people were very snobbish about wine. And so this is the level of detail we need to be able to craft a good vision in terms of whose world are you trying to change? It's not everyone, it's a very specific set. Then what's their problem? Then we can say, okay, why is that unacceptable? Because, just our thinking that it's unacceptable may not be enough, right? This vision has to deeply resonate with the people whose world you're trying to change. They should also find something unacceptable. It has to be a problem we're trying to solve. And then lastly, we're saying, how will we solve that problem? And it's specifically not solving all shortcomings, but how are we solving that particular problem that we're describing? And your point about, not trying to solve everything, we take that into strategy as well. So when you build a strategy, it's about listing all the pain points, but then very diligently prioritizing those pain points so that you don't encounter the disease I call strategic swelling, where we're trying to do everything for everyone, right? And we get very specific about what we can solve as a startup and quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I like the fact that, so again, not trying to solve the problem for everyone. Don't try to boil the ocean. Distill it down to really who you want to solve the problem for, and then envision the world for them. Yeah. Really nice. Now, I have to congratulate you first. Your book is coming out, right? You were saying.
Yes. So it comes out in September next year with Barrett Kohler.
Okay, very nice. So that book is coming out. So I wanted to find out from you what's different in the book, or rather, yeah, what's different about the book, and also the toolkit that's on the site. What's additional in the book that we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, so in the book, I describe a lot more in terms of case studies, examples, how you can use it. What happened was we released this toolkit, and then very often people would reach out to us saying, "Well, actually, so how do I use this? Do you have a voiceover that goes with this toolkit?" And so I started doing talks, and then there were more questions like, "Well, don't you have some more explanations, case studies, etc.?" And so our toolkit, as you see, has lots of text as well to try to explain these things to people. But we really realized that I think the book really is needed to be able to give people the complete guide to how do you use this toolkit. And really, it's a way of thinking. Going back to what you said about startups, for startups, it's all about speed. This isn't necessarily this isn't at all designed to be able to add more process. It's really not about adding process. It's more about adding just a way of thinking. It's stuff that becomes intuition over time as you start to use it, and then people start to think in this way.
Right. Okay. I like that. So that's one part that you mentioned at the end of your answer, which was, you work with organizations, companies, products, and they say, do you have this? Do you have that? Do you have a story that you can tell us about how radical product thinking or applying your this framework has helped the company? I think this is always the part, the nice stories that people want to hear as well, right?
I think it was the first conference that I talked at. It was O'Reilly's AI conference. And so I had finished my talk, and there were people who came over afterwards, and it felt, and this was right after we'd launched this toolkit, so it felt a little bit like celebrity status when someone came over to us to tell us, I didn't realize that you guys are the people behind radical product thinking. I found this toolkit, I started using it, and she started telling us how they were using it. This is a company called Daytank, based out of Mexico. They are a services company, and here we are building a product toolkit, right? And so these guys, they really took this idea of the product toolkit being, something that you can apply to any kind of a product, including, productizing a service that you have. And so they were really, not only were they using this for themselves because they were building some internal products, they were also starting to use this with their clients so that they could help the clients really define their vision for what they were asking them to build, define a strategy, and it helped build a lot more clarity for them between their clients. And so what was interesting was, even beyond using it, they liked it so much that the key product manager who had found this, she was talking at another conference in Mexico where she talked to people saying, "Oh, use this toolkit. Here's what we're doing with it." And this was all, even before we knew anything about how people were starting to use product thinking. So I guess my message to your listeners is, I love these stories. So please, if if you'd like to share stories about how you're using this, send me an email. It's always just heartwarming, to see kind of how this toolkit is helping people.
Moving on, I wanted to ask you about radical product thinking, and it deals with the vision side of things and the strategy on how to achieve that vision. And how does that differ, or maybe even how is it similar to, let's say, a framework such as OKRs, because you have these objectives and key results. And yeah, I just wanted to understand from you where you see the similarities or differences.
Yeah. So maybe first I should. So we talked about what is a good vision in the radical product thinking way. I'll talk about what is a good strategy. So strategy basically answers 4 questions. The first question is, what triggers someone to use your product? Like, what's the pain that they're experiencing? Then the second is, what's the design? Meaning, like, what's the solution to that pain? The third is capabilities, meaning, so you've defined the solution, but what powers that solution? So maybe it's technology, it's something that's intangible. And then the last thing is the logistics, meaning how does the solution get to the customers? And that's basically where you think about your pricing, your training, support, etc. And so answering these 4 questions, right? If you look at the business model canvas, when I first started using the business model canvas, I think it's useful, but like I didn't find it actionable. Like I didn't know what was the purpose, like how do all of these elements connect? And so we tried to help people through answering these questions by connecting the dots. So it's really pain points connected to a solution, connected to capabilities, and then a pricing model, training model, etc. And so that was the idea that, so this is basically some of the same information that's contained, but we created this in a way that makes it easier for you to share your rationale with the team. Because what would happen with a business model canvas is people would often do it just by themselves. But the whole point is that, to bring other people on the journey with you, that's where you needed to really simplify that thinking and convert it into something that's explainable in terms of rationale. So that's the strategy. And your question about OKRs, right? I talk about that as part of measurement in the toolkit. So OKRs to me, they're great, but if you look at some of the recent articles written by Google and the ex head of product at Google, so he talks about how OKRs are basically intended to provide the narrative in terms of where are we going, what's the human impact we're trying to create, right? It's not intended just as a matter of measuring, definitely not measuring people, and even in terms of measuring teams, it's not necessarily like if you set something ambitious enough, then you only hit like 70% and that's considered good, but that can also be motivating, right? So it really depends on kind of how you're using OKRs. And I've seen it used well and not very well too. And so my view in the end is that OKRs are great in terms of providing a narrative and where we're going. But execution, I think about it differently in terms of how can you tell if your product is doing well? And that comes from a set of hypotheses that should be derived from your strategy and your vision. So that's what we help people do through the toolkit. The thing with OKRs, and again, this is not to critique OKRs. I've seen them used well. I think with OKRs, very often, the one thing that goes wrong is they're set from above. And so for product teams, they look like arbitrary metrics where it's like, oh, we have to hit these numbers, right? And when it's arbitrary, people don't really buy into it. That's not really highly motivating. It's more that you have to hit these numbers to be able to get your bonus. But that's not necessarily what's driving product excellence. And so a different way of thinking about it is thinking about your metrics in terms of how does it align with your strategy and prove out whether your strategy is on the right track or not, and how does it align with your vision to know whether you're creating the change that you envisioned.
Right. Yeah. So the reason I was asking about, OKRs and the radical product thinking toolkit, or the vision statement more specifically, is because OKRs are supposed to have an overarching, like you said, the narrative of what is the main objective, and then it boils down. but there's also this cascading effect where, it starts off something as something really vague, and then as it goes down the chain of command, it becomes more granular, and that's where your what you're talking about, the metrics, comes in. And I've also seen where they also do it from the top up, where they sort of, top meets bottom, and you sort of get this OKRs, which are basically actionable by both the top and the bottom. So I was trying to understand from that approach, is that kind of similar to what the radical product thinking vision statement and the strategy piece is trying to achieve, or it's not the same? Or is it just really on the measuring part, as you were saying? Sorry.
Yeah, so OKRs are typically done on the measurement part. So the vision and strategy, regardless of how you're measuring, you still need a vision and a strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the piece that radical product thinking helps you do. And then, OKRs, they're often a summary of what you're measuring. You need, but as a product leader, you're measuring so many different things. Like, how do you decide what you're going to measure? That's part of, what we talk about in the execution portion of the toolkit.
Right. Okay, that's really, really great. And I think it has really helped me understand a lot more about the radical product thinking. I'm definitely going to be looking forward to the book as well. Because I've read the toolkit, listened to the talks, and I think there's going to be a lot more stuff in the book that's going to make it even more interesting. So you're saying September of next year, right? You're saying?
Exactly, September 2021.
Okay, fantastic. And hopefully by then, we'll all be back to our happy places where we can travel again. Fingers crossed, definitely. So many more questions I want to ask, but maybe we'll save that for next time. I wanted to jump into the last part of the show, which is the song. And you chose a very interesting song. So why don't you tell the listeners about which song you chose?
Oh, okay. I picked, it's by Eurythmics. It's called Sweet Dreams Are Made of This. But I love this song because it's 1990s Eurodance sort of music. It's, what can I say, my weakness.
So sorry, are you there? Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So for you, are you into the whole 90s are you into the Eurobeat, or are you into or just Annie Lennox more like?
No, it's really the Eurodance. So yeah, I love listening to Eurodance if I'm running, or this Sweet Dreams Are Made of This is the track I use when people intro me for any talk I'm giving. So yeah, I love this music. It just reminds me of, the school days. Oh, when I'd just gotten into MIT. That must be the link.
Interesting. Yeah. I love Annie Lennox. I think her voice is so different. So I'm a child of the 80s as well. So yeah, growing up listening to Eurythmics and then Annie Lennox, that was really, really good. So when you chose Sweet Dreams, I mean, it is very nice. I have to say my personal preference is I like Marilyn Manson's version of that, but that's a totally different genre altogether. So.
Oh, I'll have to go listen to that. I don't think I've heard it.
Oh, it's Go listen to it. Sweet Dreams Are Made of These by Marilyn Manson. So that's very, very different. But okay. So thank you so much for being on the show, Radhika, and apologies for the technical hiccups that we've had. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to leave with our listeners and our viewers?
Thank you for having me on the show. This was so much fun to talk to you. I guess in terms of parting words, I guess one thought I have is, very often this whole idea that we have to create a vision, a strategy, etc. It feels like, do we really need so much of this direction? Can't we just jump into execution? Like very often I hear from startups saying, well, like the whole point of iterating is that you don't know your vision. Can't you just start off and then discover what your vision is along the way? And to which I always say, it's always good to have a starting point, a stake in the ground, where you say, this is my vision. And the idea with this vision written in a fill in the blanks format is that you should be able to change it. That's the most important thing I can say about a vision, that we often look at a vision as something that once you've written it, that's set in stone. It's like the 10 Commandments that are just put up somewhere, right? And instead, it should be looked at as something that we periodically go back and revisit and say, is this still true? And so as a very young startup, you may start off with a vision. Then you go into actually trying it out, executing on it, iterating on it. You may come back a few months later and say, you know what, we need to edit that vision, and that's okay. But the good thing is that when you actually do that, you're bringing your team along with you on the journey. So you talked about pivotitis early on. The way to avoid pivotitis is, if you need to pivot, do, but at least you don't do it just kind of on the fly all the time. It's a grave, big change where you have a vision, you're going to change it, you're communicating this change to the whole team, and it carries more gravitas with it, and therefore it gives you that steady direction, and you will change if needed, but not kind of just on the fly and because, today this looks better.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And I totally agree with what Radhika was saying. That if you don't have a vision, you can iterate all you want, and it's not really going to take you anywhere because you don't know where you're going, right? It's like taking a journey to nowhere. You don't know what's the destination. So yeah, really interesting talk with Radhika. Am I saying it right? I keep thinking like
Perfect.
I'm saying
Yeah,
it right.
Radhika.
Radhika. So Radhika, I wish you all the best, and I will be looking forward to your book. I really want to know a lot more and how this has been working with the different companies as well. And to everyone on the show who's listening or watching, once again, thank you so much for listening and watching all the way until here. And once again, I apologize for the technical mess up. And as usual, I will catch you on the next episode. Take care and bye-bye.